Hello, folks. And if that dramatic music didn't wake you up, those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, then nothing will. So I am Paul Woodadge. We are still here at World War II TV, and this is the fourth show in our first New Zealand at War week. And there's going to be a second part of this subject in, I think, August. There's some other historians who couldn't be available this week, so I'll retouch the subject later on. And, of course, I will be having more guests from New Zealand and Australia in October and November, when I'm devoting 2 weeks, yes, a whole 2 weeks, to the Battle of El Alamein for its 80th anniversary. So if you are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click like on the videos you watch, share what we're doing on social media, and consider becoming a patron and YouTube channel member or YouTube channel member. So today we are off to Operation Crusader, and Dean Murphy just said in the sidebar, one of the most confusing battles of World War II, and I'm with you there. It is one of the most confusing battles of World War II. We are honing in on one, I'm not going to say small, but smaller parts of the battle, and focusing on the experiences of the New Zealand units there, and particularly our guest today's father, who was part of this battle. And folks, you're in for a treat, because the photographic record we have of Peter's visits to the battlefield is going to make this show really, really sensational, I think. So I'm going to bring him in now. So Peter Cox is in New Zealand. His father was part of this battle, and he has written a book called Desert Battle, and the links to that book and his website and the publishers are in the description below, as always. So I'm going to bring him in there. It's Saturday morning over in New Zealand. It's Friday evening for me in Normandy, but good morning, evening, Peter. How are you today?
I'm in great shape, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. So I said a bit there, your father was in this battle. So right before we begin the presentation, was your father someone who always talked about the war? Was it something that happened later in life? Did you ask him questions about it? Did he tell you things about it? Tell us how your interest came in his service in the war.
Yeah, well, a bit of both, actually. But the main motivation that got me kicked off finally, because my father died in 1976, so it'd been gone a long time, was that a curiosity, both from my own point of view and my son, actually, who asked me on Anzac Day about 20 years ago what my father had done in the war. And I did have a reasonable idea. He did talk about it a little bit, but it was more to do with what he got up to in Cairo with his mates and advising me not to get tattooed. But it was, as I said, Anzac Day, about 20 years ago, I really started to get interested in it. And it was fortunate that he did feature a little bit in his battalion history, because I didn't know a great deal about it. I knew where he had been. I had not a great knowledge of World War II, to be honest, and the sequence of events. So that set me off on a bit of a journey. And I started by getting his army records and reading the battalion history, which was really interesting because he did feature in it in a couple of places. And through that and a lot of research and a lot of good luck, I was actually able to track down a few people that he'd been away with that were still alive. So if you could go to, you got a photo there, so I can't see your photo, so I don't know where you're at. Could you go to the previous one?
We'll start at the beginning. We'll start at the beginning.
Sorry. Yeah. So you can flick on to the next one. Yeah, that's me at Sidi Rezegh and the following one. Yeah. So this photo was in the battalion history with the narration that in a gun pit at Sidi Rezegh, and my father's sitting in the middle behind the gun. And standing behind him it looks as though he's playing the bassoon, but it's actually a rangefinder, is John Black. And he's one of the fellows that I subsequently met. So when I got into, the more I got into this research, the more I realized that Sidi Rezegh was the big gig for these guys. And John Black introduced me to another fellow who we'll come across later, a fellow Phil Hammond. And he lived actually not very far away from me down in Christchurch here. And he knew everyone. He was one of these guys that never talked to his family about it. But as soon as we had an introduction and he got to know me, he was happy to share everything that he had. And that was brilliant. So it wasn't too long before I realized that for not only my father, but for all these men, because these others have been right through the desert. John Black got a military medal at Alamein. It was actually Sidi Rezegh was the one they kept coming back to as the most intense introduction to battle you could ever have. So over time, I was putting a lot of information together about this, and then my wife and I decided it was time to go and retrace where he'd been. So we went over to the Middle East. We started off in Cairo, worked our way through Alexandria and right through to Tobruk and down to Sidi Rezegh. And that was a real revelation. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Then we went off to Greece and fa la la. But at the end of all that, I knew so much then about the platoon, where they'd been and what they'd done. I put out a book about it, which is called Good Luck to All the Lads. And it was really it started off being about my father. It ended up being about all the platoon and what happened to them. So that triggered quite a response, actually, because it opened because I spent quite a lot of time talking about Sidi Rezegh. It seemed to open people's eyes to this was a major battle, especially for the New Zealand division, and it created a little bit of interest. So then back in a few years after that happened, you may recall Christchurch had a couple of earthquakes that knocked us around a bit, and things were pretty rubbish here for a while. So I thought as a distraction, I'd have a crack at another book and try and understand what the Sidi Rezegh battle is, right? Because the question you raised at the front, I tell you what, even now, after 20 years, I still have to go back and say, when the hell did that happen? Or, who did what to whom on such and such a day? And the records are so contradictory and everyone has a different opinion about everything that it is a very complicated battle. So bear with me if I have to refer to my notes from time to time just to check on a couple of things.
No problem at all.
So as you say, Paul, this is going to be a more personal presentation because, to be honest, I'm not a military historian. I've no training in research or military history. It's very much what I've picked up through an absolute, I suppose, commitment now to really honour the men that were Sidi Rezegh, whether they were New Zealanders or Italians or Germans. I get feedback from both of those from time to time. And they all fought in a pretty, intense and savage battle, and I think they deserve our respect. So just on my father, he was 23 when he signed up. It's just after war was declared, and went into camp down at Burnham. And I've got a photo. The next photo, Paul, please, is just that's part of his hut group there, and he's the second from the right. In the middle row there, the second row in the glasses. And the fellow next to him is the one that I mentioned previously, Phil Hammond. On his right-hand side is Phil Hammond. And I was actually able to meet 2 or 3 of those men that were still alive. And I'm just so grateful now that I did this when they were around, because there are very few left now, obviously, and all the ones that I had dealings with have very sadly passed on. So this is the photo that we were able to get John Black, the man with the bassoon, and Phil Hammond together. And this gives you a bit of a feeling for the character of the guys, particularly Phil, who was a real hard case Kiwi farmer. And even just before he died, and he was in his early 90s, I hesitated to put my hand out to be shaken because it would just about crush it. He was one of those sort of men. And he was an absolute character, and I loved him dearly, and his family became great friends. So one other little thing before because what I want to do actually is take you on a little bit of a journey, Paul, if that's okay. And we'll start off in Cairo, work our way across to Tobruk, and then head down to Sidi Rezegh. And what I want to do is use some there and now and then photos of where because when we went over there, we said let's try and retrace exactly where he had been. So that was even down to the extent of working out which rock he was beside on the pyramids, which we managed to find, and go and stand by that. And that was a lot of fun and created a lot of interest. But I think the spookiest experience of that was when we were in Greece. And I had another photo of him in another gun pit on a hilltop in Greece. And it was surrounded by quite an unusual flowers. And we were there on exactly the same hillside, on exactly the same day of the year, and the flowers were out. And that was such a weird and very moving experience. So I just thought I'll introduce one of the other characters, which you might be interested in. You can see this. This is the camera that my father used. As he said, he liberated it off a German. It's a beautiful Voigtlander Besser, and I think it's about a 1939 model camera, beautifully engineered. So that's it deserves a bit of credit for this too. So yeah, we don't need to know a lot more about his war history. He joined the machine gun battalion because he had been in a machine gun unit with the territorials. They trained for about 3 months. They left New Zealand in January. He was with what they called the first echelon, the first of 3 echelons to get the division up and running. He was with the first of them. They arrived in February 1940 and then spent basically the first year in Egypt. So when we went over, our first move was to move from Cairo through to Tobruk, and then we went down to Sidi Rezagh. So that's covered pretty much on that map there. Most of you will be well aware of that. Interestingly enough, when I started this, I didn't even know where Sidi Rezagh is. I have to admit, I just actually assumed it was in Egypt, and it wasn't. After I sort of did some research, I found no, it wasn't. And when we planned our trip, Robert and my wife said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, I really would like to go to Sidi Rezagh in Libya." And fortunately, at that stage, Libya had opened up a little bit, and we were able to get in there, so that was really good. So this just hones in on the Tobruk Sidi Rezagh area, and just to refresh people's memory, we've got the saloon on the, and I can't point these out, but the saloon pretty much on the border with Egypt on the coast, then round the Via Balbia to Tobruk, and then the road west through to Derna and Benghazi. You'll see looping round from Akroma round through El Adem. That's what they call the bypass road, which was built by the Italians to avoid Tobruk when it was occupied. The little squiggly lines are the defences around Tobruk and Bardia, I think there's some too. And I've just poked an arrow that has no significance in terms of tank movements. It's purely highlighting that area around El Adem, Ed Duda, Sidi Rezagh, Bel Hamid, which for New Zealand was right at the centre of all the action. So, Paul,
just a question for you, Peter. Leslie is asking, where did they sail from in New Zealand?
Good question. The convoys left from Wellington, but my father boarded at Christchurch, and the ships sailed they put the convoy together in Wellington and went from there.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. Can we move on to? Is there any? So, Paul, did you have any other comments about that map?
No, I think you've explained where it is. We're talking an area south of Tobruk. We're talking about 1941, and I think the battle will kind of tell itself when we start get going. And folks, as I said at the beginning, we're not going to try and attempt to tell the entire story of Operation Crusader because we'd be here for 3 weeks, and we still wouldn't be much clearer at the end of it because it's a very, very complicated battle. We're focusing on this one pivotal battle that, as we will find out, folks, was one of the most pivotal, but also incredibly costly for New Zealand forces there. So it's a very personal journey. But yeah, we'll hand back to Peter. And this is one of your first then and now shots. So where are we here?
Yeah, so let's get onto the truck and head out of town. Now, this is in the Andalusian Gardens in Cairo, which was it was around in the Gezira region, part of Cairo, very popular place. And the shrubberies, you can go to the next one now, but the next, it's very much a beautiful place, actually. So we enjoyed some time there. So then we headed over to Mersa Matruh, which is the next photo. Thanks, Paul. And on the back of this, my father had said, this is a good view of Mersa Matruh, which doesn't look the most attractive of places. So actually, when we went into town there, because we were changing at Mersa Matruh from an Egyptian crew that were taking us in our car, driver and guide, to a Libyan one. We did that change over there. That's where it was. So we stopped just on the next slide, Paul, if you don't mind. Is that's the good view of Matruh as it is today. Quite a nice. It's actually a nice place, and it's right on the seaside. And one of the other photos I had, which can be the next one, Paul, if you don't mind, is called "All Bums Are White" in this area. So that's with the bathing. I'm sorry if nudity offends, but I think it's pretty inoffensive.
That is the classic image of the Westerner in the North African desert. Is it with the farmer's tan, the builder's tan? You know, brown on top and then white in that area. That is the classic image of anybody who was out any of that part of the world. And you can tell that they've been there for some time, as you say there. We mustn't remember some of the units that took part in these desert battles had been conditioning themselves to desert for weeks, if not months, before they actually first saw combat. And it was a bit of a slow burn, the North African campaign. It kind of took a while to get going, and then once it did, it was kind of continuous action. But yeah,
it's a good point you raised, Paul, because at that time they were over in the Western Desert preparing defences. And in my father's diary, it was pretty rough language about these gun pits that they were digging day after day after day. And around that time, Freiburg was having real issues with the British High Command about keeping his division together. He'd been over in England, as you know, came back and found his minimal division, because it was only 2 brigades at that stage, one of which was in England. So the brigade that was in Egypt was actually split up in 6 different sections, parts, doing 6 different things, including digging ditches. And he had a real scrap with Brigadier, as he was then, Galloway. And Galloway responded at one stage in about October, saying that the New Zealanders are getting very good training. And I thought, what bollocks that is, because my father acknowledged in his diary that they needed training. They just weren't getting enough of it. So anyhow, that's just an aside, but it was.
And worth mentioning, folks, that Matthew Wright joined us yesterday for a really interesting show about General Freiburg and his dealings as he had to deal with the British Army, the New Zealand government, the New Zealand hierarchy, and how he's kind of a diplomat, ambassador, fighting for all these different points of view, and how difficult his job was trying to balance all those different things of New Zealand's limited resources and yet what the Empire expected of him. And Freiburg had got a really good examination by Matthew in that show there. So, folks, if you haven't seen that one, go back and watch it. It was earlier in the week.
Yeah, I'd endorse that. It was very good. So I didn't emulate him. I kept my clothes on. But it was a lovely place to visit. So just from there we headed west again to Saloum, which is, I said, this little town right on the frontier with Egypt. And the infamous Hellfire or Hellfire Pass is in about the middle of this photo, up on the escarpment, because this is where the coastal escarpment starts really and heads on through to Libya, and it was to become such an important part of all the desert campaigns, to be honest. And this road winds up the escarpment. So, Paul, if you can just plug on with that one. And that's not a lot's changed. The port's developed a wee bit, but not a lot. Hellfire
we're getting asked what years did you visit, Peter?
The first one was 2007, and the other one was 2009. And the 2009 was September, which was very shortly before the Arab Spring thing. So we were just so fortunate. The first one we only went into Tobruk. The second one was we were so keen to go back, we decided to spend a week in Libya, and we had a wonderful time. We started off in Tripoli, went down to the desert. We did the Roman ruins and Greek ruins, which are amazing, and then spent more time at Sidi Rezegh and formed the bulk of what I'll be getting onto later on.
We're just setting the scene here, folks, and explaining that effectively what we're doing, Peter, is we're doing the equivalent of what your father did, which is go there, spend a bit of time moving around, and then eventually get involved in a battle. So we're doing it with the historical way.
That's exactly what I'm doing. And this is his photo of Tobruk Harbour. And if you just click onto the next one, that's what it is today. So just the next 2 or 3, Paul, you can whip through fairly quickly. They're just little images of around some of the war relic stuff, which is around in Tobruk.
And how many people, when you were visiting there, were interested in the war? I mean, I'm from Normandy, where, you know, 1.5 million people come every year. There's museums on every street, called monuments everywhere. Is there much of an interest in Libya in the past? Did you had to kind of scour to find people who had an interest, could tell you things, or was everybody knowledgeable?
Well, we found quite an intense interest, actually. And people forget that actually this was a bit of a war of liberation for the Libyans too, because that had been under Italian rule, and some of that was pretty brutal for many years. And this battle went backwards and forwards 6 times, I think, through Cyrenaica. So they saw a fair bit of us. And I remember one being bailed up by one chap once time, and he was highly emotional about, you know, when we found out that we were New Zealanders, what New Zealanders had done for them. And I was a bit disappointed after Arab Spring that some of the war graves were desecrated, actually. And someone asked me, a reporter asked me, what I felt about that, and I said, well, were our graves likely to be desecrated? And I said, I'd be really surprised if they were, but in fact some of them were, and that was really disappointing. This is nothing to do with Tobruk, but it's Paul, you're probably aware of this, the Lady Be Good Liberator bomber. Yeah. That's a bomber that the crew got lost. The first flight in the plane got lost, and they basically bailed out of it over the Libyan desert, and it was found about 15 years later.
I'm going to be doing a show on that at some point. I haven't planned it when, but Lee Mandel has been on my show a couple of times, is planning a show about the Lady Be Good. So hold that thought, folks, because we'll be covering that in a future episode. So I thought the images you sent was the kind of poignant one, because you know, you couldn't help noticing Field Marshal Rommel mentioned there. So what are we looking at?
Yeah, well, there's a number of war graves at Tobruk, memorials in Tobruk, and I've got a couple of photos of one of them later, but there is a German one too, and we found that equally moving. You know, it's a big Germanic fortress. There are no graves there. I think all their bodies were repatriated, but they've got all around the wall of this is a mosaic of the names of their fallen there too. So we forget other people, you know, and this was just acknowledging Rommel. There's a Free French one there, which is extraordinarily good and extremely moving, and a couple of Commonwealth ones. So we were very impressed and very pleased to go to all of them. Okay, so that's got us to Tobruk. So then we had to get to Sidi Rezegh, and as we headed west out of Sidi Rezegh, out of Tobruk, I saw this. We passed by these roadworks, and I thought, I've seen that somewhere before. And sure enough, just go to the next photo. This was another photo of my father's, which he just labelled as Aussie road builders at Tobruk. So it must have been done in early 1941. But what was interesting, if you just move on, Paul, was the walls of the bank of that escarpment there, or the cutting, they had built some bunkers, underground bunkers, and you can see a couple of them poking out in there, which we went and had a look inside. They give a very good view out over that main road, the western approach to Tobruk on the Derna Road. And they had some machine gun posts set up in there too. What I found most evocative, though, was, I think it's the next slide, Paul. Yep. Yes, is the graffiti that was in there of soldiers from all over the world, actually. There was Australians and Brits and what have you. So that was it's always quite moving, I think, to see that. I did actually make a note of some of the addresses and see if I could track down. I imagine other people have tried that too, but I didn't have any success. So where are we now?
Peter, as well, that of course, you know, you mentioned there about the fact that Free French forces fought there in German and Italian and British, American, South African and Rhodesian and Australian, New Zealanders, is that in many ways the first enemy of all those people is the desert. It's the condition, it's the climate, it's the lack of water. So I suppose, you know, when veterans of that campaign have met over the years, and Germans have met British, or British have met Australians, Australians have met Italians, they all shared that experience of fighting in an inhospitable climate, terrain. So as someone who's been there twice, that I'm guessing that once you've spent a few hours walking around in the heat there, that gives you another level of empathy for what everybody had to go through, because you're just there to retrace your father's steps, but they were actually having to fight a damn war there. So it doesn't. You don't need to tell us. Obviously, hot in the day and cold at night.
Yeah, but I think the other thing and I don't think of it either, but it made me aware of it, is how did they get their food and how did they get their ammunition? And you think of the logistics. I mean, the division was 20-odd thousand men. There were 120,000 in the 8th Army, and they all had to get fed and water. There was nothing there for them, so it all had to be brought up to them. It just made me respect the people that were in the back line as well as the front line, to be honest. So these are some of the Italian defences, and I think that one and the next one, Paul, you don't mind? Yeah, it's just the Italians had spent a lot of time developing stuff. You notice just at the top of that photo a little bit of rubbish. Unfortunately, rubbish is something that Libya does very well, and in a lot of these places they were pretty messy. So just up the road from this is Fig Tree, which again you've probably heard of, which is the Australian desert, the dressing station there. There's a cave underneath it. I don't think that's the original fig tree. I think it's a cutting from it. But underneath the tree is the entrance to a cave, which was their dressing station. Very significant in Australian military history, and I think there's a cutting of the original tree in their war memorial in Canberra. And just across the road from that, just to show that recycling was in vogue back then, was this house that was built out of jerry cans, which I thought was quite innovative.
Yeah, ammo boxes, jerry cans. I mean, there's nothing like reusing stuff that have been left by, and it's just amazing details there.
Yeah. I should mention that on the battlefield itself, there is some shrapnel around. I've got some bits of this I'll show you later. But I understand, so I often wondered about this, what happened to all that stuff. But the scrap metal people got in not long after the war and cleared out all the major stuff. So it's no longer, you don't have tanks hanging around there with their droopy turrets and muzzles. So the next one, so this is the start of the bypass road, the one that I mentioned. This is actually just by the side of the Acroma Knightsbridge Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, and you can see that just on the left-hand side. And this was a cobblestone built around to circumvent Tobruk. Yeah,
and we can see it there, and there's the air of it there.
Now, if you're really keen and want to have a crack at this on Google Earth or an equivalent, the Sidi Rezegh thing is really hard to find. I have finally been able to locate the mosque and the blockhouse, and if anyone wants to know, I'm happy to let them have the coordinates. But this is actually the road through the middle is the bypass road. And just beside that, about in the middle of the picture, you can just see a tiny little slit beside it. And there's another one of those down to the southwest of that, and another one to the northeast. So that's what that is. And there's a series of these going around Tobruk. I think there's about 130 of them altogether. So that's the bypass road with one of these defensive setups. Paul, you can go on to the next one. So this is what it looks like. I think there's a couple of interesting things. One is it's really well built. There is an underground bunker. You can just see an old photo of it, but you can see there's a little chimney, for want of a better word. But also the flatness of the desert and just the significance of a very small amount of elevation and the benefit that gave. So that's just heading down into one of the bunkers there. And I think there's just a couple of other shots around that, Paul. You can flick through them probably. Yeah, this is a tank position. There were 3 of these, and what I was told, whether it's right or not, and the military people would know, that the main trench area was for anti-tank stuff, guns and what have you, and this was where the tanks would go behind these and fire over the top or whatever tanks do. Could you just go back a minute, just for a moment? Right at the very top left of that, you'll see a little strip of the bypass road. That's just at the corner where Ed Duda is. And so the significance of Ed Duda is that's when the corridor opened on the 27th of November. the Tobruk garrison and the New Zealand 19th Battalion joined up around about that corner there. So now we've
car saying which side built those bunkers.
Well, I believe the Italians. I believe the Italians. But the Australians did a lot of work on them too, so it could have been a joint effort. You know, I think that everyone built on what had happened there before.
Yeah, exactly. That's why.
Peter Fitzsimons, in his book on Tobruk, talks about them a little bit, actually. So the next one, so now we've turned off the bypass road, and I think the one thing I didn't mention on that map was I call it the Trig Capuzzo. Other people call it the Trig Capuzzo. You can take your pick. Trig's a more New Zealand way of saying it. So this is the track, the desert track, that was considered to be so significant, and that Freiberg identified very early in the piece. He had his engineers build a plaster model of this whole Sidi Rezegh area, which is interesting. And the reason he identified Sidi Rezegh as being so significant was that the escarpment overlooked both this track and the bypass road, and he felt that was the whole key to the battle for Tobruk. So we went off down this, and I showed our driver that photo of my father and his gun pit, and I said, "Well, that's where we want to go." So he definitely picked that up and put the photo on the front of his truck. So it felt, it was quite cool actually. We were going down there with my father in the truck too, in a funny sort of way.
Wow.
So yeah, a few camels, so we've cut off a little bit on the very top of that, Paul, from what I can see. But
my fault.
No, that's right. Yeah, just go on to the next one then. Yeah, so you can see the Sidi Rezegh escarpment now, such as it is. And although I didn't know it at the time, you can just see a little bit of some buildings right at the top left, not the two dark ones, but right on the top left area. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the mosque. So if you just go to the next, I think it's probably the next one.
Yeah, there we are.
There we are. And so we turned around, turned the corner, and there was this photo. And coincidentally, that photo is on the same page as the one of my father in Sidi Rezegh. So that was another nice coincidence. And I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely stunned to see it there, because I had a very low expectation when they said they'd take us to Sidi Rezegh. I thought, oh, well, they'll drive us out into a bit of the desert and say that's Sidi Rezegh, and we'd drive.
There it is. There it is, Peter. Yep.
There it is. Yeah, and it was just such it was a bombshell moment. It was a poor choice of words, but here we were suddenly and totally unexpectedly right at the middle of where this battle had been, and it's exactly the same as it was all those years ago. I'll just show you, Paul, I hope this will show up all right, but that's actually just a little fragment of it. You can see the white and the green of the roof. I just emphasise that there was no desecration of any building to get there.
Yeah.
There were a lot of them, because it had shelled so much. There was quite a lot of it just lying in the desert. But I thought that my soldier friends or veteran friends might have appreciated seeing because a lot of them never saw it, although they were all round it. It was just a little bit down the escarpment, actually. So if you weren't quite close to it, you wouldn't have seen it, and a lot of them didn't see it. So that's just really showing how it stands out on the escarpment. And
I'm glad you mentioned the escarpment there, because we're going to show maps in a minute, folks, because when you're reading about Operation Crusader and you're talking about elevations and height differences, and people have already been saying in the sidebar about a slight difference in height makes all the difference, and of course everyone's got to dig in. You've got to dig shell scrapes and foxholes.
Yeah.
When you approached it and you saw the mosque there, did you get a sense of it being an important area? Did you get a sense of that elevation change?
Yes, you did, and some of the other photos will show that up better. But and it's your other person's right. It's interesting. I mean, we're going to get on to point 175. And the orders were go and take the hill. Well, the hill was a meter above the rest of the desert, and it was a gradual meter. It wasn't, there's nothing there. So, yeah. And if you just, oh no, you don't need to go back. The desert is rock, basically. Oh, you can see in front there, it is rock. And I think that's pretty well known now that it's not a sandy desert. And so your chances of digging a decent hole in that are pretty remote. And John Black wrote back to me after I'd been there and said, now you understand why the pickheads turn their noses up and pointed back at you when you tried to dig yourself in there.
Definitely.
Yeah. So anyhow, that got us to the mosque. The mosque, as we all know, I think now, was actually the tomb of an Arab holy man and his son, and quite a sanctuary, actually. We had lunch in there, which sounds a really bizarre place to have lunch, but it was a nice place to shelter from the sun and the wind, and was well used, obviously, by a number of sleeping mats and other bits of domestic stuff around. That it wasn't, because I was obviously paranoid about desecrating anything like that, but no, it was very much in day-to-day use. So that's
our first map, folks, because we've kind of set the scene. You have followed your father's steps through the battlefield there. We've talked about it being rock. We've talked about the slight elevation now, but now I suppose we have to bring up the Operation Crusader. That you mentioned Freiburg's recognition that this is escarpment, and then there's the bypass, as we call it, and this track that goes down. I'll let you kind of explain.
Yeah. Well, I just want to go a bit of background, Paul. I'm sorry, I won't say it's the boring stuff, but I think it is important that I think most of your people watching this will know probably as much or more about this than I do. But of course, Wavell in 1941 was under a lot of pressure from going back into early 1941 from Churchill to get on the attack. But he also got distracted through the Balkans, and for New Zealand in particular, the Balkans were in Greece and Crete were a total disaster. And of course, while they were there, Rommel arrived, and he started storming east straight away. So by mid-1941, the Germans and Italians had got to the border here, with the exception of Tobruk, which was surrounded and held somewhat precariously by the Allies. Then in June, around this area of the frontier, Wavell embarked on battle axe to have a crack at pushing Rommel back. And after 3 days, that was called off as being a disaster. And I think it's memorably talked about how Churchill retired to Chartwell and started knocking heads off thistles or something in disgust. Anyhow, so Churchill then sacked Wavell shortly after and appointed Auchinleck, and who also appointed Cunningham as the 8th Army Commander. Now, Auchinleck, I've been reading all about him lately, so he's quite an interesting critter. One of the first challenges he had was getting to grips with dealing with troops from the Dominions, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, and it'd be fair to say he had his hands full. And I think it needs to be acknowledged that both, particularly the New Zealand and Australian governments, after the First World War, were going to take a lot of interest in how their forces were looked after. And as Connell, Auchinleck's biographer, said, that in Australia and New Zealand, there was still the belief that many lives had been sacrificed as a result of the strategic exuberance of Winston Churchill and the incompetence of British generals. Well, that was not us saying that, but let's move on. And one of the first challenges that Auchinleck faced was the Australian government put their foot down and said they wanted their troops relieved out of Tobruk. And they were unrelenting despite a lot of pushback from Churchill. And finally, the Australians were relieved in about September, October, except for one battalion. But Auchinleck was pretty unhappy about that, and you can understand why. But it sort of set the scene for an uneasy relationship, I think. And another challenge he'd faced at the time is that Peter Fraser, the New Zealand Prime Minister, had been feeling uneasy about Freiburg because of the losses in Greece and Crete, and felt that he hadn't been informed. So he went and asked opinions of a number of people, including Auchinleck and Wavell, about Freiburg, and they all came back and totally endorsed Freiburg. And Auchinleck said, look, he'll prove his worth when the bullets start flying. So there was an uneasy period, I suppose, and I'll talk a bit more about this. But Battle Axe, so there were three major, I think personally, there were three major things going into Crusader that needed to be just taken into account. One was Battle Axe. Paul, one of the things I've enjoyed doing, this is a bit of a distraction, but is looking at something like Crusader. I have the 4 sets of official histories, the Playfair's British one, Murphy's New Zealand one, Barton Moorn's Australian one, and the Agar Hamilton Turner South African one. And that's the last one's actually, I really like that one. But the South Africans' view about Battle Axe, and I'm going to read these quotes, I think they're quite fun. They commented that that it seemed to the South Africans that the sacking of a number of officers was deemed an adequate remedy for the inadequacies in equipment and training and systems of command, which were the principal causes of defeat. And the failure to digest the lessons resulted in untrained British tank units continuing to career lightheartedly about Cyrenaica in November and December 1941, making gallant charges against anti-tank screens and positions, disdaining the assistance of the artillery, and looking with autocratic distaste on intrusion into the tangled affairs of the infantry. Well, Freiburg wasn't quite so eloquent, but he also felt that the lessons by just sacking generals actually wasn't helping the case, and learning the lessons about coordination of tanks and anti-tank and all that stuff weren't being learned. So, I mean, that is important to the New Zealanders because we were relying on the British tanks and anti-tank for protection of our infantry. We didn't have our own armour in those days. I think the other point which Alan Brooke, as he was then, talked about was the pressure put on Wavell with such an immense region to deal with, everything from Syria and Iraq to the Western Desert, and he was appalled that with the concept of Battle Axe being taken on when they were trying to run, why don't we consolidate and do one properly, basically was what he was saying. The second thing about it, and I've touched on it, is the tanks and the anti-tank thing. The 2-pounder, I'll talk more about later, and everyone I think knows now that the inadequacies of the 2-pounder and the challenges that gave the tank crews and the anti-tank one. And the New Zealand historian Murphy, who in fact was an anti-tank man himself, said the Germans possessed one advantage which almost outweighed all their disabilities, and that was their anti-tank guns. So the third one from the New Zealand point of view, and I've touched on most of this, I won't go through it before, was that was their state of readiness for the battle. They had difficulties getting their division organised right from the start, with one brigade going to England, 2 coming to Egypt, and then going off to Greece. And Greece really was the first time that the division had been together, so it wasn't a great induction. They lost about 35% of the division in Greece and Crete, and of course then they had to reinforce with inexperienced men. Fraser, as I said, was disgruntled, and Freiburg going into this camp said, just reflected that they had really 2 very costly campaigns, losing men and equipment. And while they wanted a success, what was most important actually was that they didn't have another loss.
Yeah,
so,
no, exactly. Yeah.
So the plan for Crusader, I think most people know that the 30 Corps of the Armour would charge through the wire, head for Tobruk. The 13 Corps, which included the infantry, was mainly infantry with a 1 brigade of I-tanks, would protect the border until the tank battle had been won, and then they'd all head gloriously west. The New Zealand division, 20,000 men in 3 brigades, 4, 5 and 6 brigades. Freiburg's, when the plan was announced, Freiburg had a number of concerns. One was splitting the corps, and one thing you could see two corps fighting two separate battles and not coordinating their resources. A major concern was who would command the tanks and protecting the infantry. He had a real aversion to the concept of tanks in support as opposed to being under command. He was majorly concerned about the indication that this was going to be a brigade group battle. He and Blamey, the Australian commander, were really averse to having their division split up. And he wasn't the only one. I think Cunningham, Norrie, the tank commander, was also not too thrilled with the plan. Anyhow, in September, just before we get to the airport, in September, Freiberg wrote to the government and said, 13 September, we're now moving to the Western Desert, and we're up to war strength and heading to the Western Desert, and I'm going up tomorrow. Well, it was only about a 3 or 4 line letter, and it got to Wellington, and Fraser hit the roof because, having told Freiberg he needed to be kept informed, suddenly they're off to war, and he didn't know about it. And he was there was a spirited exchange between them, and he also brought Churchill and Auchinleck into the conversation. And it was all about this issue of tank support and air support. Had they learnt anything from the lessons of Greece and Crete? So that was a big issue for him. They did quite a lot of training before Crusader in the desert, but they didn't do any with tanks. They used, because they had no access to tanks, they did their tank training with trucks. And that's I'll come back onto that later too. So mid-November, they trucked over to the desert. You saw that in the previous slide. 19 November, the division, the whole column moved west with the armour leading. And as Kippenberger, one of the colonel at that stage, later brigadier, said that just as they were passed through the border and rejoicing a massive move on Tobruk, disregarding the frontier defences, the whole army broke up and went in different directions. And that really summed up their frustration and concern that, if they'd gone bang straight for Tobruk, leave a couple of, a division or whatever to manage the border, but instead everyone went in different directions. So the tank battle, which this one really, I think, and this one covers basically, you can see the 3 armoured brigades going in different directions. It had been hoped that Rommel would come out at an early stage and they could confront him. Rommel didn't come out until he heard it on the BBC, I think, that this was for real. And so the 3 tank brigades got further and further separated. I'm not going to get into the tank battle because that's too complicated for my tiny brain, and there'll be other people that can do that far better. But by the evening of the 22nd, the 30 Corps was compelled to retire, having lost 2/3 of its tanks, and leaving the garrison of Tobruk, who had started to fight their way up with a huge salient to defend. Now, I just want to, before I go on, I do want to acknowledge, Paul, really the bravery of the British tank and anti-tank people. And everyone knew that they were, at a significant disadvantage. And I was very fortunate that a family of a British anti-tank gunner, Alf Blackland, with the Royal Horse Artillery, gave me all his letters. I don't know how they got through the censor, to be honest, but he said that he wrote back to his family, and he said that the British tanks were good, but in his words, they spoiled the thing by sticking a stupid little 2-pounder in the turret. And the result is Jerry's cruisers and heavies have a 6-pounder or 75mm and knocks hell out of them, of ours, before they can close into an effective range. I think it's always good to get that word from the people really at the pointy end. And he said, as far as the anti-tank gunners are concerned, it's the same. It was a suicides game. You only stand an even chance with the light tanks. The heavy ones stand off just out of effective range of your guns and let go with the 6-pounder. So to have actually got in their tanks, got behind those anti-tank guns, knowing that they were going this, you have to have huge respect and admiration for them.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, Peter, because it's come up on World War II TV often, this idea of the top trumps comparison between armour and this tank is better than this tank. But of course, there's still tank crews, and when we come to do Al Alamein 2 weeks in November, Gareth Davies of the Royal Tank Regiment serving officer is going to give us a presentation about this armoured action, I think, in Tobruk, because he wants to get across the bravery of the Royal Tank Regiment units, even if they are in vehicles, as you say, that are undergunned and that the plan perhaps isn't perfect. They're still going in there with all the bravery and spirit you would imagine a British soldier would. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you very much.
I just can't comprehend how they did it day after day. It's just, I think that we need to really honour that. And I know the New Zealanders did. I know they had their issues about tank tactics and the way the battle was managed, but there was never any question of their admiration for the tank and anti-tank crews.
And this is the 22nd of November map, isn't it now? Yeah.
Yeah. So this is at the end of basically having the tank crews are basically on their way out. But the important part from our point of view is seeing on the right hand side, the New Zealand Brigade is having to start to come into play, because Freiburg was ordered to send in one brigade and then two to come to support the support group, actually, who were surrounded at Sidi Rezegh. So on the evening of 22nd, or I think it was the 21st or 22nd, off they went. And so this was really the start. Their orders were pretty uncompromising, just to head west, go to Sidi Rezegh, start fighting, and get in touch with Gott. So it doesn't come more blunt than that. So we had the three battalions, 24, 25, 26 of 6th Brigade, and four Brigade also a little bit later on a more northerly approach, but was heading in the same direction. So to do their task actually was going to be to overtake 3 major hurdles to get to before they would be able to join up with the garrison at Tobruk, which was what their objective was. The first one was point 175, the second one was the blockhouse, and the third one was the mosque. So this is where I think we need to start. I want to start talking quite seriously about our trick. I see I'm taking a bit of time on this, Paul, and I apologize.
Brilliant stuff, Pete. Don't worry. And I'm glad you put the German map in as well, because I think we ought to remind people what the Germans are trying to do at this point, and Italians, we should point out as well. Yeah,
exactly. This one, I actually took a photo of this in the museum at El Alamein. I thought it was a cracker of a map. It's a bit hard to follow, and I think I've got this on my website if people want to have a look at it, because it shows the New Zealand Brigade there which is the, if you like, the I don't know how you call those, that shape of arrow, the solid arrows of the German ones. So you can see that it wasn't looking good at that point. The British. Point 175 is just we're under the Africa Regiment 361. You'll see point 175 there. So that's where they were heading. One battalion, 26th Battalion, went down to try and help the South African Brigade, which was, of course, overrun the day before. So immediately, I think one thing, just a couple of points about this. The New Zealand historian Murphy says this is one of the most important actions that the division fought in the campaign, this attack on point 175. It was the first attack of the campaign. And for most of the men, a lot of the men, well, this was their first attack. I mean, the time in Greece and Crete was basically running from one bunkhole to the next. This time they were actually going on the offensive. And it included some men, of course, that were in the reinforcements that hadn't had the experience. A really important thing which hadn't occurred to me until I met Phil Hammond was so many of their officers were new. While Greece and Crete was underway, they were being trained. So all the junior officers had such a critical role as platoon commanders. This literally was their first battle, and right at the toughest possible engagement, taking on the, although they didn't know it at the time, that Africa Regiment. And they were very anxious about doing the right thing. They didn't want to let the side down. They were just so paranoid about being seen to do the right thing, even if it might, be terribly challenging. It was the first attack with tanks, and remember that I said that they'd done no training with tanks. So they had no idea of how to coordinate them and what the relative timings were between the advance of a tank and the advance of an infantry. It sounds extraordinary, but it was the case. And then the next one is the terrain. So if we could just, so this is a wartime photo of from point 175 looking east. Okay, so that's looking into the direction. Now, if we can just hold this one for a moment, if you don't mind, Paul, because this is probably one of the most important photos that I've got on here, because this is the approach to point 175. Now, I'm just going to quote from a letter written by a New Zealander, which is, I think, really interesting, who had fought at Sidi Rezegh. And this letter is dated 8 January 1942, and he's talking about this. About the where they were fighting. The country itself was ideal for a war from the point of view of damage. There were no hills, trees, cultivation, water, crops, houses, stock, or inhabitants. That is, as regards the area in which we were playing, so that the two teams could have a fair go without any indignant property owners writing to the local newspaper about unnecessary noise, dust, or rubbish strewn about. The surface itself is not all sand, but an expanse of barrenness covered with stunted grass, scrub, and ground being covered sometimes with flat rocks or pebbles or dry clay. There's no continuity. One gets to a point on the horizon and sees more horizon. It's like being at sea. Now he's talking specifically about this. Sometimes an escarpment will surround a huge area like a saucer's rim with little gullies running out of it. Sidi Rezegh, where we did most of our running around, was featured with a number of escarpments and small rough gullies which were difficult to handle. The highest point was 175 metres up. That's what he's talking about there. And although this looks flat and expanse, in fact, it is almost a promontory. You could imagine it being a peninsula going out to sea, because on the left-hand side was an escarpment, a wadi, the Rugbut in Nabairat, excuse my pronunciation, and that curved round from the left to and out through the centre. And on the right-hand side, and we're going to spend some time on there, with the escarpment, about 80 feet down to the desert floor, if you like, in the Trig Capuzzo. Now, you can't see point 175. I don't know where it is, to be honest, but all I can suggest, I can find it on Google Earth, and if you move your cursor around, it'll quietly move from 172 to 173 to 174 and 175 meters. So you know that's where it is. That's all I could find. The other little thing you'll see right pretty much in the middle of that, there's just a tiny dot on the horizon. That's the blockhouse. Okay, so that would be the next one, and that was about 4 miles away. So this point 175 promontory, about 2.5 miles long and about 1.5 miles wide. So the 6th Brigade arrived here. It was about mid-morning. Colonel McNaught, 25 Battalion, was given the task of taking it, and this would have been about the start line where it is, because it's actually a little track here. You can see the bit of markings of there heading off down the escarpment on the right-hand side. What they didn't, and so he scanned the area, he searched the area, they all did, to see whether there was any enemy around. They couldn't see anything anywhere. Unfortunately, what they didn't know was that this Africa regiment, a very tough, really experienced, hard-nut German, was surrounding it, but they were all just slightly below the level of the plateau, and they had their particularly the anti-tank guns, machine guns, just literally with the muzzles appearing above the ground. So McNaught, anxious to be seen to be doing the right thing, knew that the support group was in trouble, had to make some really hasty decisions about how to attack this. And how do you attack that? There's nowhere to hide. There's really hard to make a flank move or whatever. And the military people will know that, far better than I can explain. Anyhow, they went into, they put three companies out to attack, one in reserve. They just started off, and about 10 minutes later they stopped. Were ordered to stop, and tanks, about a dozen or 15 I-tanks were sent up to support them. So they started again, but this is where the timing issue got all wrong. He had no idea what speed the tank should advance. So unfortunately, the tanks took off, got way ahead of the infantry, rushed right into the anti-tank guns, and were annihilated. So that the infantry were left stranded out there with no support at all, and it was they were not in great shape. So shortly after that, I'm just going back to my notes, seeing if I've missed anything. No, so a little bit later, around about noon, they called in a couple of companies of 24 Battalion to assist, and also my father's machine gun platoon. So they had 2 machine guns. As the way Phil put it, they were sitting around, they'd just had a brew, putting a brew up, and the intelligence officer for 25 Battalion came up, said, "You guys the machine gunners?" And as Phil said, some dopey bugger said yes. So he said, "Right, follow me." So they, it's hard to believe that this actually happened. So they got their trucks, the machine guns loaded, and off they went. And as they went out, following this intelligence officer, they said, we're going far too far forward. They were past the infantry, past the artillery, just heading into no man's land. And so suddenly the intelligence officer stopped, and they started debussing and trying to get their guns out. Well, they were immediately under huge pressure because there was no support. They were out in the middle of nowhere. So the major came up and said, "Get over the escarpment." So if you could just take the next slide, Paul. So they headed over to the side of the escarpment and basically spent the rest of the afternoon there being absolutely hammered. And we'll just run some other slides in a minute. But essentially what happened was that 25 Battalion hung on to the hill until evening with tremendous losses. 25 Battalion's losses. They had 100 men killed in the course of the afternoon, and that was the highest number killed in any one New Zealand battalion in a single day's fighting in the whole war. So that's just gives you some for New Zealand. That, I mean, it's not the Somme, it's, you know, but that's pretty significant for New Zealand. So we can just scroll around the next 2 or 3 slides. So this is a contemporary one, literally showing what was going on the side of point 175, and you can see how it was very. I mean, this was tremendously moving, because I knew that this was exactly where my father had been, you know, on this hillside, and it hadn't changed. You know, you can see this battlefield if you go to the next one, Paul. There's all around these escarpments, there's these little sangars, these brick rock shelters where they tried to get some shelter from the machine guns, and the Germans then had tanks marauding this part of the escarpment, including a British Valentine that they'd captured, wearing a swastika. So they spent the rest of the day basically just sheltering and trying to stay alive. The next one, you could see the next one or two if you wouldn't mind.
I mean, and you can see that, you know, the fact that this was 2007, 2009. You know, you're there 60 plus years later, 70 plus years later, and the fact that these stones are still pretty much where they were left is clear that this isn't a place that bus tours of tourists are going week in, week out. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. You know, and as you said earlier, stressing the fact, and this with the rockiness, you can't dig in here. You have to just make something around you, to a sanger, and try and find a little bit of a dip and try and build up around it. And the fact it's all still visible there 7 decades on is really amazing.
Yeah. So that's where my father was, and you can see that I deliberately took that photo with the rock in front of it, so you can see that how difficult it would have been to have dug in anywhere there. And so anyhow, basically those that could, they left a lot of their mates there, unfortunately, that day. But at sundown, they managed to find their way back. There was pretty much a truce overnight as both sides went out and basically looked after whoever needed looking after. If it was a German looking after a Kiwi or vice versa, it just happened. But unfortunately, it was the winter was, it's very cold, and a lot of them just succumbed to it. So anyhow, it was. It was a bad day for the Kiwis. My father's platoon lost 11 men, dead or missing, and others wounded. So about half of them, more than half of them, were casualties. So yeah, and actually there is a sorry, you probably can't see that, but that's a little volume of the New Zealand war history just on this attack, which is you can usually find a copy on aid books or somewhere. So yeah.
What's that particular dip we're looking at there, Peter?
It's just an example of one of the wadis. That's all. There's nothing significant about it, but there was quite a range of the types of terrain there. Some of them were rocky, some of them were just quite wide and what have you. But there were German camps over there. There was tanks marauding, all sorts of stuff. But anyhow, so yeah, I'm conscious of time, Paul. So it's
don't worry, it's fantastic. And people are just saying, take your time. It's brilliant. No worries. It's fantastic. So yeah, and there's another map showing. We'll push on the next stage.
This is a really simplified one because I've just you can get bogged down in these things. So they got 0.175. But just before I go on, Paul, what would have happened? What would have been the effect if they hadn't taken that hill? So we had Rommel had cleaned out the 3 armoured brigades. He'd pushed over the South African 5th Brigade. What would have happened if this slot had fallen? So, and say New Zealand 6th Brigade was out of action. It's an interesting question. I'd love someone to war game it, someone with more knowledge than me, but you can't help but feel that was an absolutely critical battle for them to have held their ground there, and to have held the Germans from being free just to roam anywhere at that stage, because what was left, there was one brigade of New Zealanders in the Indian division, and that was about it. So things would have been pretty bleak, I think.
I think the point is that, as we said, that Operation Crusader is such a large and complex campaign. It's difficult to understand when you're looking at it from another country, and perhaps because of its scope, because of its complications, it's sometimes hard to see the kind of the wood for the trees. And clearly, this is a really pivotal moment here. And thank you very much for explaining it.
Yeah. So I mean, the good thing is Rommel's dash for the wire, which most people will be well aware of it. He took the opportunity to hurtle east. Hoping he'd sort of just take out all the supply dumps and what have you, but it just gave the Brits time to regroup, really. And but if I was thinking before that if instead of rushing west, he'd just cut up through here, and cut the New Zealand division in half, things would have been pretty dicky, I think.
It's definitely a key moment. Yeah.
Yeah. So. God, there was a lot happening around about now, because this is the time when Cunningham was getting a bit wobbly on it too, and I think it was the 23rd, the night of the 23rd, he was thinking of calling the campaign off, because they had been thinking that the British tanks were on a roll. They saw them advancing away, and they thought it was all over. That's why they ordered the Tobruk garrison to come out and meet them. Which was where Alf Blackland was, curiously enough. He was in Tobruk. So Alf, it's quite funny, because Alf was, I've thought of this, he was out in Tobruk fighting his way out, and my father was on this side fighting his way in. So that's just one of the funny things of war. Yeah. So Cunningham called up Auchinleck. Auchinleck said, no, you've got to continue. They had a conference. Godwin Austen said, I couldn't possibly ask Freiburg and the New Zealanders to call off their attack. It would be unthinkable. And if you call it off, it'll be the greatest disaster the British Army suffered for centuries. And of course, Auchinleck sacked Cunningham shortly afterwards and put Ritchie in for what it was worth. So anyhow, the next step was the blockhouse, which was, I said, just over the other side of the 0.175. So this is, believe it or not, this is a wadi. This is taken from beside the blockhouse, looking back towards 0.175, and that is the wadi that they had to cross over, which actually was quite formidable, because there was so many gun anti-tank and machine guns set up around the blockhouse. But there's the blockhouse. And that was finally taken on the 25th, I think it was, but not without some pretty heavy fighting. So, Paul, you might just like to scroll around the next few photos, because it's really, sorry, if you can just go back one. Yeah, I love looking at these old photos and then seeing where the same shell holes are on the modern ones. Now, that sounds really ridiculous, but it just, it makes the authenticity of it. And you say, yes, that really did take a hammering. So this was just, I think, a traveller's rest place on the edge of the escarpment, but it was very heavily defended. And again, it just shows you, and I said I'd come back to this, but so there's one or two of these, I think, that are looking back over the escarpment, just to give you an idea of, that's looking to the west, I think, that one. Oh, no, east, sorry, that's looking east. And that's looking over the northern escarpment towards the Trig Kibbuzo and the that's the Sidi Rezegh escarpment, looking towards the Bel Hamit northern escarpment with the Trig Kibbuzo behind them, and that's looking south. So again, I'm just really trying to say that this is a hell of a lot of nothing there, and that the New Zealanders were attacking this area against well-prepared, well-dug-in defenders. Extraordinary to me that they did it. And a lot of this from now on was in night attacks. So imagine doing that at night. Okay, where are we? So so this is just on the ground between the blockhouse and the mosque. I'm just trying to find out where I am here.
Well, you're doing perfectly. Don't worry. People are absolutely spellbound, and these photos are absolutely amazing. And people are saying it's like watching the Desert Rats film, and it's
yeah.
If we were just looking at black and white photos, this would be very different. But because we've got these amazing color shots, we feel like we're there, Peter. It's really amazing.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, that's what I was hoping to do. I should say that we were very apprehensive about the landmines because there's 10 million of them still in Libya, according to well-known authority Lonely Planet, and they are for real. Our guide's brother, he said his brother had lost his leg to a landmine, and so it was very much a matter of rock hopping, to be honest. And there were a lot of them around, and we weren't expert enough to know whether they were, live or not. We just treated everything as live. So the next attack they had was the mosque, and this was a hell of a challenge for them because they were running low on puff, to be honest. They were running low on people, and they had a very complicated battle plan to try and attack the mosque, which didn't actually work. So they had to take 2 or 3 days over it, or nights actually. And what happened with the machine gunners at this time was the reason I've got that photo is that there's some orders got screwed up, and in one of the night attacks, what they interpreted their and orders were to be spread out on a front 1,000 yards in front, a line 1,000 yards in front, and in actual fact, they were meant to be on a front of 1,000 yards. So, in other words, they got 1,000 yards ahead of where they should have been, and ended up right in the middle between the enemy and the British forces, and they were just plastered by everyone. And there's some very sad stories about it actually, because one of my father's mates was wounded there, and this mate's brother was in another gun crew. Just a few yards away, but it was so intense he couldn't get over to his brother, and his brother died. So it was it's just one of those awful situations. So Paul, just can you just scroll through the next few photos, and I'll tell you when to stop, because these are the sangars and rock and gun pits, but around the area above the mosque. And again, I'm just really showing this because nothing's changed about this. It's uncanny. you do feel a strong sense of history about being there and what they went through, trying to attack over this sort of country at night, not knowing where they were. They didn't know what day it was. It was just extraordinary commitment to and bloody mindedness, I suppose.
Yeah, these Sanger photos are really amazing, and again, thank you again for showing it. And the fact there are all these mines in there as well. I mean, it's
you just hold that one, Paul. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
I was just saying. I mean, the fact that you're going back there, recreating your father's footsteps, but also you're recreating to some extent the danger, because the rocks are still there, the mines are still there, the climate is still there. The only thing not there are the Germans, but the other perils are still there in spades.
Yeah. So the reason I put this one is that's the mosque you can see in the front, right in the middle there. So we're way up above the mosque now, and you're looking over to the Bel Hamit escarpment, which is the one. So Bel Hamit would be at the far end of that the left-hand side of that on the northern escarpment. There's you can see a landmine in the front of here, just a little dark spot here. One of the guys I met up, one of the old guys, was captured here. And I sent him this photo, and he said, "Oh hell, I wish I'd seen that landmine. I would have jumped on it. It would have saved me 3.5 years in the prison camp." So it was just an interesting perspective. He found himself looking at the pointy end of a Panzer, and it literally was, "For you, the war is over." That one, and so. Which is a whole nother story, Paul. You can tell you what you want to do sometime is what happened to those prisoners of war that were captured in North Africa, because some of the men I met or their families were on the Jason, the one that was torpedoed by the British, and lost 500 odd people. So anyhow, that's another story. So just moving along, it's just typical Libyan photo of landmines, barbed wire, and a plastic bag. Yeah. So the next couple are just taking us down to the mosque, and one more, I think, Paul, if you don't mind.
One more, and then we have the wartime one.
Yeah. So where are we? So that by now, we're now talking about the 27th. The New Zealanders took the mosque around the 26th, 27th. What was really interesting about it is that Kippenberger went round it the morning after, and he said it just showed there was absolute carnage that they saw there on both sides. And what he said was interesting, well, not interesting, but it was an observation that the Italians were the ones that had really fought it out to the end, not the Germans, which is contrary to public, perception. And I remember being in Italy once a few years ago, well, 10 years ago, I suppose, and we were in a little village in Tuscany, and it had a war memorial there, and I went and had a look at it, and there was one name mentioned, and the date was around about this. It was obviously a Sidi Rezegh casualty, and I thought, bloody hell, you've got these boys from a village in Tuscany and boys from villages in New Zealand fighting it out in Libya. What was all that about? It was just very crazy stuff. Anyhow, it was a monumental feat of arms for them to take that area around the mosque, just because it was so heavily defended by very competent people who are well armed and well equipped to do it. So they had really run out of puff at that stage, 6th Brigade. So 4th Brigade was given the task of joining up at Ed Duda, which they did on the night of the 27th. So I've just put this in. It's really hard to get all this stuff in sequence, so I apologise. So we're ducking and diving a little bit, but this was really just showing the period where the German tanks were out of action, if you like, looking to clean up things out east and not being very successful, except that they did overrun the New Zealand 5th Brigade headquarters there, and Brigadier Hargis that Matthew mentioned yesterday was captured when that happened. So where are we? So I don't want to spend too much time on this map because they're too hard to follow. But this shows the area around the 29th of November to the 1st of December. So things were really starting to build to a climax, because by the 27th, the corridor was open to Tobruk. 6th Brigade was hanging on at Sidi Rezegh. They were spread out right along that escarpment, very thinly held, and running out of ammunition and food. And 4 Brigade was sitting on Belhamit. So they were all there, but they were all very vulnerable, very depleted. And the German High Command were yelling for the tanks to get back to Tobruk. They're being very rude. They're telling Rommel to hightail it back west, basically. So they did on around about the 29th. They started coming back, and that's when the real action happened. During that time, the New Zealanders almost by accident captured von Ravenstein, the CO of 21 Panzer, who went for a bit of a joyride in the morning, and ran into a bunch of 19 Battalion, I think they were, and they captured him. And they had the men, everyone that met him, they had immense respect for this man. They thought he was a very good guy. Anyhow. So what happened in the last day, around the 30th and 1st of December, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this shortly, but so they won South Africa Brigade and was ordered to come and support the New Zealanders, bearing in mind that they had left 1 brigade behind and they had attacked as a 2-brigade division, which was the real anathema to Freiburg that they ever should have done those anyhow. But they sent to reinforce them. They sent that they tried to send that South African brigade. They were pretty reluctant to go anywhere, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And then, so on the 1st of December, they were forced to withdraw. So that's what those 2 red arrows are, one going up, one coming down. And also the 4th Armoured Brigade, which had by that time merged with 22 Armoured Brigade. They had about 100 to 120 tanks, were also meant to come in. There's another story in that. So, yeah, so I don't think we need to spend any more time on that one, Paul.
So back to your the contemporary photo.
Oh, yeah. So the reason I put this one in is that around about this time, my father was cooped up on the Sidi Rezegh airfield. So that's between the mosque and the blockhouse. And I suppose I'll get a bit personal about it for a moment. This photo mesmerised me for years. You know, it was especially when I blew it up before, and you could see my father. He's staring straight. To me, he was staring straight at me, and he had told me at one stage that he was at Sidi Rezegh. I was asking him whether he'd fought at the Battle of Alamein, and he said no. He said, but I was at Sidi Rezegh, and I never really took on board what that meant, and he never embellished it. And unfortunately, he died, you know, before I was old enough to really go back and say what was all that about. And I suppose that part of my trip back was I'd really like to find that gun pit and go and sit in it. So, I mean, the next photo is me in a gun pit, and it's obviously not that one, but it's certainly right in the area where it was, and I felt quite a sense of closure, I suppose. It's very much an involved word, which I don't really like, but it did mean a huge amount that I could, having not had the opportunity to talk to my father about it, to go back and honour him and his mates by going back to see where they'd been and what they'd done, and really get as close an experience as possible in a non-battle situation.
Well, you said at the beginning, Peter, that you're not a proper military historian, but you by going out to the battlefield, walking the ground, looking at the details, picking up the geographical features, retracing the steps, you absolutely are a military historian, and you've got the connection with it that makes this story work. So, you know, don't put yourself down. There's an excellent difference you're bringing to this, that perhaps someone who's doing this as part of a war studies, thesis, who's never actually traveled to North Africa, they may have the learning and the tools to explain history, but you've got the passion and you've got the connection there. So you absolutely are a military historian. So back to you.
I'll put it on my CV then, Paul. Thanks.
Yeah. You tell your CV that Paul at World War II TV says you can say that. So another contemporary photo there. So what are we looking at here?
This is, well, I think these might be some out of that camera. To be honest, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
When Dad told me that when he took the film out of the camera, there was photographs of it, of taken by the Germans of what was going on, and this may have been one of them. I don't know. It's just, I mean, this was the 1st of December, 30th of November, 1st of December. This is when it all fell apart. To 6th Brigade, they were, I won't say overrun, but they were clearly, the South Africans hadn't arrived. The 4th and 20. Oh, no, I'll leave that for a moment. So these are what I'm trying to do is say that in the last couple of days, the New Zealanders had to make a decision as to whether they were going to fight it out to the end, like Ukraine, or whether they were going to pull back what they could and get back to Egypt. They decided the second. So what happened was that 6th Brigade went and joined a 4th Brigade at Zafran, and I'll talk about that later, which is on the northern escarpment, and made it back to Egypt. But so the next few photos are really just saying, well, because there's one or two contemporary photos, but this is the terrain that they went over. So this is the edge of the escarpment. You can see how slight it is. This is taken from the mosque looking eastwards down to the side of the escarpment. And the next one is looking back up the escarpment to the mosque from down by the Trig Capuzzo. It's just showing the area where they were. I mean, Phil Hammond's description of this is hilarious because it was one of the he actually he sat down one night and wrote out for me about 20 pages, and he was about nearly 90 at the time. His story of Sidi Rezegh, the first day, that attack on point 175, and this withdrawal when they were really under the pump. So this is the terrain that they were really heading out over, if you like. That photo definitely did come out of the camera. I know that because Dad told me that was a British convoy that was on the film.
Yeah, I mean, they're just amazing photos, really are.
Yeah, well, that's right. I'm trying to intersperse them with the two, so you can bring the black and white ones to life a little bit. That's one of General Freiberg, and he got slightly wounded there. Actually, he got a bit close to the action, as was his style.
Yeah, it was about, I think Matthew Wright says in the Greek campaign, he had 11 different staff cars shot out from underneath him, which is, people may criticize him or think he's great, but if you're having 11 staff cars shot out from underneath you, you're definitely not avoiding the action. You're definitely in the thick of it. So
yeah.
Stuff. That one there, you've obviously got, is that the vehicles and is that buildings, or is all that is all vehicles in that photo?
It's all vehicles, yeah. I know that is 6th Brigade under attack. I do know that one. I think that's a war history one, that one. So, Paul, there's just a couple of things I want to talk about. You can leave it on that slide because there's, and that is that there's a couple of controversies on what happened on the last day. And the first one was that, or the last few days, that 6th Brigade, as I said, were spread out along the Sidi Rezegh escarpment. My father was in that gun pit. And they'd been told not to be careful who they were shooting at because the South Africans were meant to be coming. And I love Barry Pitt's, the Crucible War, is it? The histories. Anyhow, as he put it, that the New Zealanders we're waiting. He said the South African appearance was expected hourly by every one of Freiburg's men with some of the eagerness of beleaguered Western pioneers awaiting the US cavalry. And that would be fair comment. But Pienaar was a pretty stubborn character. And to be fair to him, who was the South African brigadier, the South Africans had been really, the other brigade had been cleaned out a few days earlier, so you can understand his concern. But Norrie decided, who was the 30 Corps commander, he said to apply some ginger, and he went out and kept, as he said, sending rude messages to Pienaar to get him moving, but he never did. And they never arrived, so that the New Zealand Brigade was trying to convince the army headquarters to let them withdraw into Tobruk. But they said no, they wouldn't allow them to. You've got to hold your place there until the South Africans arise. And as the 6th Brigade diary said, it was doubtful whether the Corps commander really appreciated how vitally important it was that Sidi Rezegh and Point 175 be captured, and how improbable it was that the South Africans could take them, because Point 175 and Sidi Rezegh at that point were held by the enemy. So, and they never did arrive. So that was one disappointment. But the other one, which was somewhat more confusing, was what happened about 4 and 22 armoured brigades. And I could spend all night talking about this. So I spent days and days researching it, and it is so contradictory what happened. And that they had orders to come and support the Kiwis, to fight it out. They said their orders were only to support the Kiwis withdraw. And who said what to whom? You line up the four official war histories, they all have a slightly different version of it. But again, what happened was that the Kiwis wanted to counterattack. They saw with 120 tanks, they could do some real damage, even with limited infantry support. But the tankies said no, their orders were only to assist the Kiwis to withdraw. So who's right, who's wrong? I don't know. I'm happy to debate it. I've been doing quite a lot of research on it. And so the different opinions, the different histories have different opinions about it. Playfair just plays it straight back to the bowler, as you can imagine, and just says that they withdrew, to support the Kiwis. And the Kiwis undoubtedly were very appreciative of having the tanks around at that point. The New Zealand guy was a bit more abrupt and said that it's not flattering to Great Gatehouse's brigade that the remnants of a German tank battalion could turn about from a very severe action and appear to drive away a fresh British force which outnumbered it in tanks by about 9-1. So you can take your pick as to which version you take.
We had a question from Dean Murphy about what did the new Kiwi troops think of Pienaar and the South African leadership generally?
Well, I think they respected him, but I think that he had a reputation as being a brigadier, that whenever an order arrived, it was the opening of as a basis of opening a conversation about it. And so they certainly didn't appreciate the lack of support that they got from on that day. They were absolutely bitter. In fact, Barry Pitt said, so I'm going to finish this off with another quote, but so here they were, they battled their way through to Tobruk, to join up the Tobruk garrison, despite the 2 Panzer divisions and everything. And he said, during these last days, an unscathed South African infantry brigade in an armoured formation with over 100 tanks manoeuvred gravely in the far reaches of the desert without, as far as Freiburg could see, attempting to do anything to help him. It was not surprising that this did nothing to raise his opinion of the reliability of armoured formations, that he did not regard Dan Pienaar with much affection, and his wireless conversations with his corps and army commanders were curt and much to the point. So that might answer that question.
Well, yeah, I think that does. Yeah.
So, but I'm not. I don't want to use this as a bagging session of everyone. Everyone was under intense pressure here, And in fact, later in the war, the New Zealand commanders had to really clamp down on what they perceived some arrogance creeping into the New Zealand division. And they said, you do not know what some of these other people have been through, so I tend to steer away from trying to, I'm very happy to say what other people were saying or thinking, but my own views, I'm not a soldier. I've never been in a situation like that. So it would be totally inappropriate for me to say. Anyhow, the machine gunners, their diary says there was a wild stampede of trucks across the desert. Control was gone. As a fighting unit, the brigade was useless. So that's pretty. So the next slide, Paul. This is what I'd mucked around so long on 0.175 that our driver was getting agitated that it was getting late in the day, and it was. And by the time we'd finished on 0.175 and got down onto the Trincapuzzo again below the escarpment, it was starting to get dark. Now this is looking back on the escarpment, and about a quarter of a way, you'll see just a little dot on the horizon, another little dot. That's the blockhouse again, looking back up the escarpment to the blockhouse. So this is exactly the area where the two brigades were regrouping, getting their support from 4 and 22 armoured brigades before they moved out and back eventually to Egypt 2 or 3 days later. Now, if I say the funny part of this, it actually wasn't really funny at the time, but it really was getting dark and very quickly. And our driver had no sense of direction. And here were we in this little Toyota pickup, wandering around the desert. And it was the only time I felt really nervous about the landmines, because it was dark. We couldn't see where we were going. He didn't know where he was going. And we ended up right on the edge of the escarpment, at Zathran, where these guys would have aggregated. Anyhow, we finally got it sorted out, but I must admit I was decidedly twitchy at that point.
Well, yeah.
So I think that's so they ended up basically going back to Egypt. Now, after that, the New Zealand 5th Brigade was still there, and that joined the pursuit, basically head over to Gazala, and the rest of them went home. Just one last one there. See, I'm well over time, Paul. I'm really sorry about that.
Don't worry, it's fine. It's all good.
The next one is, I don't need to go into that in detail, particularly now, but the next photo is that's my father's company at the end of Sidi Rezegh. They went in with 134, and 10 days later they were down to 38. And I can actually pick my father out, and he's sitting in the front on the left, next to the guy that's lying down there. So 134 down to 38. It's quite a hammering. 6th Brigade took, were about half the New Zealand casualties from 6th Brigade. Paul, I was going to go through, but I don't need to, the lessons of the campaign and what came out.
We're in for a penny, in for a pound. Let's carry on. Don't you've got to go somewhere. Please give us the lessons.
Okay, I'm not a preacher, but so what came out of this campaign? Well, Auchinleck, and this is his weighty gazette thing, which you're welcome to have a look at if you want to. It was a success, but rather slower, more costly, and less complete than I hoped. So I don't know what you take out of that. Certainly, it did push Rommel back, and Auchinleck is credited as saving Egypt. So take it what it is. But he did acknowledge that their standard of tank armoured leadership and an ability to coordinate the actions of the tanks and infantry needed improvement. That was the key one. I've already talked about the New Zealand appreciation for what the tanks did, and I just want to reinforce that. Freiberg's report was interesting because there's two versions of it. This is the sorry, I'll try and find that. That's the final version of it. There's also an unexpurgated version of it because he had a bit of a crack at things like brigade group fighting and what have you. That Auchinleck wanted deleted, so that's they were taken out of it. Freiberg was so grumpy that his view was that the only way he could safeguard the New Zealand division after that was to get them away out of Desert Command. So that's when they went off to Syria for 3 months. After another couple of scraps over the way, the 5th Brigade was used, but that's a story for another day. But I think just, and I know why that slide's there, but just a couple of quick quotes. As far as Freiberg thought that that this was their most significant campaign in the war, and that that he said that he thought that the move west on towards Sidi Rezegh on 23rd was one of the most significant actions that they took. He said the high watermark of the division and battleworthiness was at Sidi Rezegh and Belhamit in November 41. And if they hadn't taken Tobruk, the battle at Sidi Rezegh on 23 November, the Battle of Alamein would have been fought a year earlier and without the Sherman tank. So they were no doubt that this was, and other officers have said it too, that this was the peak of fighting for the New Zealand division in this campaign. And it was largely because it was relative, say, to the bank, to Alamein or even Cassino or whatever, they were doing it on their own. It was the infantry really just carrying the weapons that they had with them, were carrying the battle. Tremendous. And it's interesting, it is for New Zealand, total casualties 4,620, the greatest in any of the 8th Army divisions, and higher than any other campaign in the war. And yet when New Zealanders talk, they talk about Cassino, they talk about Crete. Sidi Rezegh's the forgotten battle, the one that no one knows about. It's just another one of those desert battles. I was just going to talk about POWs. Total casualties for the Axis forces were 38,000, of which nearly 30,000 were prisoners. So that's just a couple of photos of the German prisoners of war that ended up on my father's camera or someone's camera, I don't know. And British casualties, 17,700, which 7.5 with POWs. So that's just a little contemporary cemetery somewhere outside Tobruk. Just a couple of final things. I know I've only scratched the surface on this, and I do respect. I just want to say that I do respect whatever any one of the forces, particularly the Allied forces, did at Sidi Rezegh, because it was such a hell of a scrap. The father survived this, obviously. He went. They went to Syria. They rushed back for the first Alamein. He was in first Alamein, and I'd love to do a session on Ruwai Sat Ridge and El Maria Tor, because he was running around in a minefield in a Bren gun carrier there. Anyhow, then he got jaundice, and that was basically the end of his career. I just want to show you his medals, and not for any particular reason. There's nothing exceptional about them, except you'll see that he's got the Africa Star there. But what's not on it is the 8th Army medal, 8th Army clasp, and this was a source of great discontent in New Zealand that there is a coveted bar for the desert for the North Africa, the Africa Star, but only for those that were in the 8th Army after the battle of the Second Battle of Alamein in October 42. So that a lot of all the New Zealand soldiers in the 8th Army that fought at Sidi Rezegh and First Alamein don't qualify for that 8th Army bar, and it's made a lot of them very grumpy.
Understandably, no, I mean, and we've already had requests to bring you back to talk about the next battles and whatever you want to talk about, basically. And yeah, and I'm glad we're finishing with photos of the cemeteries, because it was one of New Zealand's darkest days in its military history.
It was one of the most moving things I've done, because when I went away, Phil Hammond and John Black had given me lists of graves they'd like me to visit, and I did that. And when I came back with Phil Hammond, I went and gave him back a folio of photos of all the graves, and a bit of shrapnel and a rock, and he labelled off a Stella beer bottle and things like that. And I was there with him and his daughters, and we went through these graves. And as we went through them, he just burst into tears, and it was just such an amazing emotional night. And the next morning, because he'd never talked to his family about this, and the next morning I got a call from him and said, "Look, you're our brother now. You can't leave." He talked all night, and
Wow.
It was obviously such a relief. Paul, can I just finish with one more quote, if you don't mind? Then I promise I'll shut up. So, because I think this sums it up. This is from the New Zealand historian, Murphy. The Eighth Army in its first campaign, like the French early in the First World War, fought with superb élan. The spirit of the British cruiser tank units in the opening clashes, unavailing though all too often it was for tactical and technical reasons, was magnificent. At the same time, a battle designed around armour was adorned with some of the finest infantry assaults in the annals of the British Army. The attacks on the Black Watch on Tiger, which was one of the Tobruk breakout points, in the breakout from Tobruk, and of the 60th Rifles at Sidi Rezegh, the hard fight for point 175, and the relentless night attack on the mosque showed what men could do with little or nothing more than the weapons they could carry. They deserve to be remembered. So that's it from me.
Yeah, no, I mean, people are loving it. As Willie Robertson, a long-time viewer, this is one of the most captivating World War II TV shows I've seen for a long time. Thank you, Peter. Brad is saying, "Thank you so much, gentlemen. This history is so interesting." So, the thing is, it's about putting this battle into the context of the desert campaign, because as you said there, the Operation Crusader, it didn't reach all its objectives. It wasn't a complete victory, but it definitely wasn't a loss. And I think it's like when we study as a Normandy student, you have to look at all the Normandy campaigns, Epsom and Jupiter and Goodwood and Bluecoat. And as you said there, it's all part of the learning curve. James Colvin is coming on in November to talk about the early sort of 18 months of the Eighth Army, basically learning how to do desert war. And this is marking one of that points in that learning how to do desert war. And if without Operation Crusader, without the stand of the New Zealand and South African forces, we don't get to El Alamein, a year later, with what they'd learned from that. So it's really important stuff. And brilliant stuff. So we said at the beginning, before going live, Peter, you would love to hear from people via your website, and your website is in the description below, who have a relative who fought in that battle. You're happy to exchange archives. Dermot Rooney is already saying he's exchanged some files with you, or you've given him some files. You're always happy to hear from other people who have either studied this or have a relative involved in this, so they can get in touch with you via your website. That's
absolutely correct. Love to hear from them. Yeah. And there's a lot of what I've talked about today is on the website, and if they want copies of photos, let me know. I'm happy to let them have it. It's just no big deal. It's really about spreading the word and honouring the men. That's it for me.
Brilliant. Well, all good things come to an end. I'm going to take you off screen for a second to remind you what we're coming up. I'll come back and bring you in a second. So, folks, nothing this weekend. I've got a weekend off. Mag is hopefully over COVID now. I think I may have had it, but I'm going to do a test before I go out again. But next week we have 4 shows. Our second part of our Germans at War. So I'm looking at some of the campaigns from the German point of view. But there's a couple of extra shows next week coming up as well. Then I'm working on July Animals at War week. There's lots of stuff coming up. I'm going to be having a 2-week break in July because I'm off doing some traveling and some other stuff, but lots more stuff coming your way. If you've recently signed up to become a patron, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. If you haven't, please consider it, because if you keep me going, I can keep bringing you people like Peter, and we can keep bringing these shows. So that's my last bit of housekeeping there. I'm going to bring Peter back in to say goodbye, basically. So you've got a whole day ahead of you, while I'm going to go and have a beer and go to bed. So it's really the weekend for you. So brilliant. You said you're a bit nervous about doing this, but you took us through that battle in exemplary fashion. The photos are fantastic. The maps are great. And as we said at the beginning, Crusader is not an easy battle to explain, but you've managed to take one part of it and make it understandable. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks very much, Paul. I appreciate it. And I'm just pleased it's not another cricket test to watch this weekend.
No, well, yeah. Well, don't get me. I don't do cricket. I'm that rare Englishman doesn't give a crap about cricket. It's all about Ipswich Town Football Club. Anyway, right, folks.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining with us. I will see you all next week. There's Paul Wood for World War II TV saying enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you all again on Monday. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.